1 soldier. 1 grenade. For minutes. 18 dead. 160 lives saved. February 13, 1945. Outside Manila, a 20-year-old private from Oklahoma City made a decision that collapsed 3 days of projected casualties into a single afternoon. He didn't charge the enemy position. He didn't suppress it with superior firepower. He forced them to choose the only exit available, then killed them as they emerged, one after another, like an equation solving itself in blood. This is the story of how applied intelligence under fire became the difference between a company pinned down for days and a company that walked forward into the afternoon light. This is the story of Manuel Perez Jr. The heat at Fort William McKinley on the 13th of February 1945 was not the dry heat of summer plains or desert campaigns. It was the wet, suffocating heat of the Philippine lowlands during the dry season, a heat that turned uniforms into second skins of sweat and canvas, that made metal too hot to touch with bare hands, that turned thinking into effort. The air itself felt thick, resistant, something to push through rather than breathe. Canteens ran empty faster than they could be refilled. Salt tablets dissolved on tongues that felt like leather. Men learned to move slowly when movement was not required, conserving energy for the moments when speed meant survival. The men of Company A, 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 11th Airborne Division, had been fighting through the fort's defensive perimeter for 3 days. They had destroyed 11 Japanese pillboxes in sequence, methodical work that required coordination, covering fire, explosive charges, flamethrowers when available, and acceptance of the arithmetic that said some percentage of the men moving forward would not move back. Each pillbox had been a problem unto itself, a tactical equation that required assessment, planning, execution, and the acceptance of cost. Each one had taken time measured in hours, casualties measured in men wounded or killed, ammunition measured in hundreds of rounds expended to suppress positions that were designed to be difficult to suppress. Fort William McKinley had been built by the Americans at the turn of the century, named after a president assassinated in 1901, expanded and reinforced through decades of peacetime garrison duty. When the Japanese had taken the Philippines in 1942, they had inherited a fortress complex designed by competent military engineers who understood the principles of defense in depth. The Japanese had improved it. They had added positions, reinforced structures, created interlocking fields of fire that turned every avenue of approach into a studied problem in geometry and firepower. They had prepared to hold it, and they were holding it with the kind of methodical determination that characterized Japanese defensive operations throughout the Pacific War. The 12th pillbox was different. It sat at a junction that controlled 3 approaches to the interior fort complex. Its position had been selected with care by engineers who understood interlocking fields of fire, who knew that the value of a defensive position increased geometrically with the number of angles it could dominate simultaneously. Twin heavy machine guns, likely Type 92s, commanded every avenue of approach with overlapping cones of fire that left no dead ground, no covered route, no angle that allowed for maneuver. The concrete was thick, pre-war construction reinforced to withstand naval bombardment. Firing slits were narrow, positioned to maximize outgoing fire while minimizing incoming vulnerability. Company A had tried twice to take it. The first attempt had been standard doctrine, the kind taught at every infantry school and proven in hundreds of engagements across multiple theaters. A base of fire team established suppression while a maneuver element attempted to close the distance using available cover. The theory was sound. Suppress the enemy position with sufficient volume of fire that the defenders cannot effectively engage the maneuvering element. The maneuvering element closes the distance, places explosives, or uses flamethrowers to neutralize the position. Execute, consolidate, continue the advance. The machine guns had opened up at 200 meters, effective fire that forced men to ground immediately, then traversed methodically across their positions with the kind of disciplined accuracy that indicated experienced gunners who understood their weapon systems and had pre-planned their engagement zones. 3 men wounded in the first 30 seconds, hit as they attempted to move between covered positions. The maneuver element pinned, unable to advance, unable to withdraw without accepting additional casualties. The base of fire unable to achieve effective suppression through the narrow firing slits, their rounds sparking off concrete or disappearing into the darkness of the apertures without discernible effect. withdrawal under smoke, casualties extracted under covering fire, dragged back to aid stations where medics worked with diminishing supplies of morphine and sulfa powder. First attempt concluded with nothing gained and 5 men removed from the effective roster. The second attempt had used more men, more smoke, more suppressive fire, more ammunition expended in the attempt to overwhelm the position through volume and aggression. The planners had adjusted based on lessons from the first assault, adding additional support elements, timing the advance to maximize the effectiveness of smoke concealment, concentrating fire on the firing slits with designated marksmen attempting to kill or wound the gunners through precise shot placement. The result had been more casualties. The machine guns had simply waited until the smoke thinned to the point where targets became visible again, then engaged at closer range with even more devastating effect. The defenders had patience, discipline, and the enormous advantage of fighting from prepared positions against attackers moving across open ground. For more wounded, 1 killed, a private from Tennessee who had survived the jump into Leyte and the mountain fighting and died advancing across 30 meters of open ground toward a position that did not fall. The mathematics of attrition were clear and unforgiving. The Pillbox could sustain this exchange indefinitely, trading ammunition for American casualties at a rate that favored the defense. Company A could not. Major Henry Burgess, commanding the company, stood 200 meters back from the position, behind a low concrete wall that had once been part of the fort's interior defensive works, now pockmarked with bullet strikes and fragmentation damage from previous engagements. He was 26 years old, which made him ancient by the standards of combat infantry where platoon leaders averaged 22 and squad leaders were often teenagers with 3 months of experience who had survived when their predecessors had not. A West Point graduate who had jumped into Leyte and fought through the mountains and had learned that tactical problems sometimes had no good solutions, only less catastrophic ones. He had learned this lesson through direct observation, through seeing plans fail and men die and objectives not taken, through the accumulated experience that turned theoretical knowledge into practical wisdom purchased at the cost of other men's blood. He was looking at a problem with no less catastrophic solution visible, and the weight of that assessment pressed on him with physical force. Flanking was impossible. The Pillbox position had been selected precisely to prevent flanking. The terrain to the left rose into open ground with no cover. The terrain to the right narrowed into a killing funnel between 2 structures. Going around meant a detour of several hundred meters through unknown defensive positions, possibly into more interlocking fire. Going around meant time, and time meant the Japanese had more opportunity to reinforce, to reposition, to prepare. Time was a resource they did not have in surplus. Artillery was unavailable. The guns were committed to supporting other units in the drive toward Manila proper. Air support was theoretical, weather-dependent, and required pulling assets from higher priority targets. Armor was not an option in this terrain. The standard solutions were not available. Burgess was considering the non-standard solutions: a night infiltration, a diversionary attack from multiple directions to split the defender's attention, waiting for darkness and attempting to place satchel charges directly against the structure. Each option carried its own casualty estimate. Each option required time to organize. Each option had failure modes that would result in more wounded men and no progress. The company was spread across whatever cover existed within 200 meters of the position, an improvised defensive perimeter that would have horrified peacetime instructors but represented the best available under the circumstances. Men pressed into shallow depressions in the ground, behind fragments of wall, in the shallow ditches that rainwater had cut into the compacted earth over decades of monsoon seasons, behind rubble piles and damaged vehicles and the foundations of structures that no longer existed above ground level. They had been there for 40 minutes since the second assault failed. They were drinking water when they had it, checking ammunition counts and redistributing rounds to ensure that those most likely to need them had adequate supply, treating minor wounds with the contents of individual first aid kits, watching the pillbox and being watched by it in the mutual observation that defined the static phase of infantry combat. The machine guns had not fired since the last withdrawal, conserving ammunition, but everyone knew they were manned, that the gunners were watching the approaches through their gun sights, that any movement in the open would draw immediate fire with all the advantages of surprise and prepared positions. The temperature was 33 degrees Celsius. Humidity near 80%. Men were dealing with heat exhaustion, with the early stages of dehydration, with the accumulated fatigue of 3 days of continuous combat. Some had malaria. Some had dengue fever. All had the 1,000-meter stare that came from watching friends die and knowing more would die and knowing you might be among them and discovering that this knowledge did not make you brave or cowardly, just careful and tired and focused on the next decision. Private First Class Manuel Perez Jr. was 20 years old. He had been born in Oklahoma City on the 3rd of March, 1924, the son of Mexican immigrants who had come north during the Depression searching for work that did not exist in sufficient quantity anywhere but seemed more possible in America than in the villages they had left. He had grown up in a neighborhood where English and Spanish mixed freely, where work was scarce and family was everything, where the Catholic Church provided community and the military represented both opportunity and duty and a pathway to citizenship for those who had not yet achieved it. He had enlisted in 1943, age 19, motivated by patriotism and practicality in measures that he probably could not have separated even if asked. He had trained as a paratrooper, earned his jump wings, deployed to the Pacific Theater and discovered that training prepared you for some things but not for others, not for the actual weight of combat or the way time compressed or the 1,000 small decisions that determined whether you lived or died in circumstances that training could not fully simulate. He was short, 5 feet 6 inches, compact and strong in the way of men who had worked physical jobs since childhood. He was quiet. He spoke when necessary, observed constantly, and had developed a reputation among the platoon as someone who understood how things worked, how mechanisms functioned, how systems could be exploited. He was lying behind a section of broken masonry 60 meters from the pillbox, closer than most of the company, in a position he had reached during the second assault before being forced to ground. He had been watching the structure for the entire 40 minutes. Not watching the firing slits, which told him nothing. Watching the structure itself. The shape of it. The way it connected to the ground. The ventilation points. The angles of construction. And the rear exit. It was not obvious. It was not marked on any tactical map they had been issued. But it was there, a low opening on the back side of the structure, partially concealed by vegetation and angled away from the direction of expected attack. Perez had noticed it during the second assault, in the seconds before he had gone to ground. A tunnel, probably, a secondary entrance or emergency exit that allowed the defenders to evacuate if the main chamber was compromised, or to move between defensive positions without exposure to direct fire. He understood what it meant tactically. The pillbox was designed to defend against frontal assault. Its weapons faced outward. Its armor was thickest at the front. Its firing slits allowed the defenders to engage approaching enemies with maximum effect while remaining protected. Standard assault doctrine called for suppressing those firing slits, closing the distance under covering fire, placing explosives or using flamethrowers to neutralize the position. The defenders expected this. They were prepared for it. Their weapons were positioned for it. But they were not prepared to defend both the front and the rear simultaneously. If the main chamber was compromised, if smoke or fire or explosives made the interior untenable, the defenders would retreat through the rear exit. It was not cowardice. It was survival logic. Humans under immediate threat moved toward perceived safety, and the tunnel represented the only route that did not involve advancing into the guns of the attacking force. They would move through it in sequence, single file or doubled up depending on the width, focused on escape rather than security. And they would be vulnerable. Perez understood this with absolute clarity. He understood it the way a mechanic understands that removing one bolt will allow an entire assembly to separate, the way an electrician understands that cutting one wire will kill an entire circuit. The pillbox was not an impregnable fortress. It was a structure with one exit that could be exploited. He did not ask permission. This detail is important. He did not radio back to command. He did not request authorization for independent action. He did not explain his tactical reasoning to his squad leader or platoon sergeant. He assessed the situation, formulated a plan, and began executing it. In any other context, this would be a breach of discipline, a violation of command structure that could result in court-martial. In this context, it was initiative, the quality that separates soldiers who follow doctrine from soldiers who win battles when doctrine is insufficient. He moved. The approach required him to traverse 50 meters of open ground at an angle to the pillbox, staying low, using the minimal undulations in terrain for concealment, moving during the brief moments when the defender's attention might be focused elsewhere or when the angle of observation from the firing slits made detection less likely. This was not a sprint. This was controlled movement, each step placed deliberately, weight distributed to avoid noise that would carry in the afternoon air, silhouette kept below the sight line that would make him visible from the firing slits or from any security positions the Japanese might have established in depth. He moved in segments 3 meters at a time, then paused to observe before moving again. The heat was enormous. Sweat ran into his eyes. His uniform clung to his back. His rifle, an M1 Garand weighing 9.5 pounds, felt heavier with each meter covered. But the movement was possible because he had identified a route that exploited the geometry of the position, that used the angles of the pillbox itself to create dead space where observation was difficult. 20 meters into the movement, he encountered the first Japanese soldier. The man was positioned in a shallow fighting hole 15 meters from the pillbox, a security position designed to provide early warning of flanking attempts. He was looking toward the American lines, rifle ready, unaware that someone had already bypassed his field of observation. Perez closed the distance, eliminated the threat in close combat, continued moving. No shots fired. No alert raised. 30 meters. A second soldier similarly positioned. Same outcome. Perez was now operating inside the defensive perimeter, in the space that the Japanese had designated as secure. He was behind their lines in a tactical sense, moving through terrain they considered controlled. 40 meters. 2 more soldiers, positioned together, focused outward toward where the next American assault was expected. Perez engaged both quickly and quietly. For enemy killed, 0 shots fired, 0 American casualties. The math of infiltration. He reached the rear of the pillbox at approximately 1500 hours, 15 minutes past 3 in the afternoon. The rear exit was as he had observed it, a low tunnel mouth partially concealed but accessible, angled downward into the earth before connecting to the main chamber. He could hear voices inside, Japanese, discussing something in tones he could not understand but could interpret from cadence and volume as tactical assessment rather than panic. They did not know he was there. He carried 6 grenades, standard load for a paratrooper in combat. He had used none during the day's fighting. He selected one, a Mark II fragmentation grenade, 4.5 ounces of high explosive surrounded by a segmented iron body designed to fragment into dozens of pieces of shrapnel. Effective killing radius 5 meters. Casualty radius 15 meters. Lethality dependent on containment and distance. The tunnel would provide maximum containment. He pulled the pin, released the spoon, let the fuse cook for 2 seconds to prevent the defenders from having time to throw it back. Then threw the grenade into the tunnel entrance with enough force to ensure it reached the main chamber before detonating. Then he moved to the tunnel exit and waited. The grenade detonated at 15:17. The sound was sharp and contained, less a bang than a concussive thump that indicated detonation in an enclosed space. Immediately there was shouting inside, the kind of urgent, overlapping voices that indicated casualties and confusion and the instant recognition that the position was compromised. Then they came. This is the moment that defines the engagement. This is the 4 minutes that saved 160 men. The defenders, confronted with a grenade in their enclosed space, smoke and fragmentation and the possibility of more grenades to follow, made the only decision that survival instinct allowed. They retreated through the rear tunnel. They emerged in sequence, moving fast, focused on escape, weapons ready but attention divided between the threat behind them and the unknown space ahead. Perez was waiting. The first man came out at speed, disoriented, and Perez shot him at a distance of less than 3 meters. The second man emerged seconds later, stumbling over the first, and received the same outcome. The third man came with weapon raised but insufficient time to acquire a target. Fourth, fifth, 6th men emerging into a fatal bottleneck where speed and desperation worked against them, where the geometric advantage belonged entirely to the man positioned outside the exit. 8 men killed at the tunnel mouth in sequence. 8 individual decisions to seek safety through the only available exit. 8 identical outcomes. This was not combat in the traditional sense of 2 forces engaging with mutual fields of fire and cover and maneuver. This was systematic elimination of targets who had been forced by circumstance into a single predictable location. When no more men emerged, Perez entered the tunnel. The interior of the pillbox was smoke and damage and the aftermath of the grenade detonation. The twin machine guns were still in position but unmanned. Additional Japanese soldiers, wounded or disoriented, were attempting to organize a defense or to understand what had happened. Perez engaged them in close quarters, using his rifle and grenades in the confined space, eliminating resistance until the position was secure. When Company A's lead elements reached the pillbox 3 minutes later, they found Perez standing outside, weapon ready, the position neutralized. 18 Japanese soldiers dead, attributed directly to his action. The twin machine guns silent. The route forward open. Major Burgess arrived minutes after that. He looked at the pillbox, at Perez, at the enemy dead arranged in their telling pattern around the rear exit. He understood immediately what had happened, understood the tactical logic and the execution and the sheer efficiency of it. He said something to Perez that was not recorded. Perez said something back, also not recorded. Then Company A moved forward, and the timetable that had projected days of fighting collapsed into hours. The advance continued through the afternoon and into the evening. The breakthrough at the 12th pillbox allowed the regiment to push deeper into Fort William McKinley's defenses, to exploit the penetration before the Japanese could reposition. Objectives that had been scheduled for the 15th and 16th of February were achieved on the 13th. The human cost of that acceleration cannot be calculated precisely, but it can be estimated. Every day of urban combat produces casualties. Every defensive position engaged costs men. The speed of the breakthrough meant positions were taken before they could be fully prepared, before reinforcements arrived, before the defenders had time to maximize the advantage of prepared defenses. How many men did not die because Company A moved forward on the 13th instead of the 15th? 20? 50? The number is unknowable but not theoretical. Speed in combat is measured in lives. That evening, Major Burgess wrote the after-action report and initiated the paperwork for Perez to receive the Silver Star, the third highest military decoration for valor. The recommendation went up through channels, through battalion to regiment to division. At division level, someone reviewed the action and concluded that the Silver Star was insufficient. The action was upgraded to recommendation for the Medal of Honor. This is where bureaucracy almost buried the story. The Medal of Honor has quota restrictions, official and unofficial, designed to maintain the decoration's significance by ensuring it is awarded sparingly. The 11th Airborne Division had already submitted several Medal of Honor recommendations for the Philippines campaign. The division commander was informed that additional recommendations might not be approved, that the quota for the division might be exhausted. The recommendation for Perez was at risk of being downgraded back to Silver Star or Distinguished Service Cross. Major Burgess refused to accept this. He escalated the recommendation, provided additional witness statements, documented the tactical significance of the action in detail that emphasized not just the valor but the impact. He argued that this was not ordinary heroism but the kind of tactical initiative that changed outcomes at the operational level. The recommendation went to higher headquarters, was reviewed again, and was approved. Manuel Perez Jr. never knew this. On March 14, 1945, 29 days after the action at Fort William McKinley, Private First Class Perez was killed by a Japanese sniper during operations near Antipolo, east of Manila. He was on patrol. He was doing his job. He took a round through the chest and died before medical aid could reach him. He was 20 years old. He had survived 43 days of continuous combat in the Philippines, had fought through the mountains of Leyte, had made one of the most tactically significant individual actions of the campaign, and died in a random engagement that produced no meaningful tactical outcome. The Medal of Honor was awarded posthumously. The ceremony took place in Oklahoma City. Perez's father, Manuel Perez Sr., received the medal on behalf of his son. The citation read in part, "He courageously advanced alone under heavy enemy fire to a position near the rear of the fortification. Throwing grenades through its rear entrance, he forced the enemy to flee through the front entrance. As they emerged, he killed 18 of the enemy, eliminated the position, and allowed his unit to advance." The citation is accurate but insufficient. It describes what happened but not why it mattered. It lists the dead but not the living. It records the action but not the geometry of it, the tactical intelligence that turned a prepared defensive position into a trap with only one exit and one man waiting at that exit with absolute clarity about what would happen next. Fort William McKinley was secured on the 15th of February. Manila was declared secure by the end of the month, though fighting continued in pockets for weeks afterward. The Philippines campaign continued through the summer. The war ended in August. The men of Company A who survived went home, and most of them never spoke in detail about what they had done or seen. In Oklahoma City, a housing project was later named after Perez. In Chicago, a military recruitment center bears his name. There are memorials and plaques and historical markers, the standard apparatus by which societies remember military valor. These things are appropriate and necessary, but Perez's real memorial is unmarked. It exists in the negative space of the historical record. It is the engagement that did not happen on the 15th of February because the breakthrough occurred on the 13th. It is the defensive position that was not fully prepared because there was not enough time. It is the casualty list that was shorter than it would have been. It is the letter that was not written to a family, the notification that did not arrive, the funeral that did not take place. It is the men who walked past the 12th pillbox alive that afternoon, moving forward into the uncertain geometry of the next objective, carrying their fear and exhaustion and relief and the knowledge that someone had solved the problem that had pinned them down. Most of them never knew who. Most of them never knew how. They only knew that the guns stopped and movement became possible, and the hours that followed did not extract the price that had been expected. War is not a story about heroes. War is a story about decisions made under pressure that produce outcomes measured in lives. Some decisions are good. Some are catastrophic. Some are brilliant. Some are made by 20-year-old privates who observe a structure carefully enough to understand its vulnerability, who act without permission because permission takes time and time costs lives, who execute a plan with tactical precision and die 29 days later in an action that means nothing. The silence after the guns stopped at the 12th pillbox lasted perhaps 10 seconds before movement began. Men rose from cover. Orders were given. The company reformed and advanced. The afternoon continued. The war continued. The men who lived continued living until they did not. One soldier. One grenade. For minutes. 18 dead. 160 saved. And afterward, the quiet mathematics of combat accounting, the recognition that applied intelligence under fire had collapsed time and distance and casualty projections into a single decisive action. There is no moral to this story. There is only the event and its consequences. There is only the recognition that sometimes survival depends on someone seeing what others missed, acting when others hesitated, and forcing the enemy to make a choice with only one outcome. Manuel Perez Jr. saw the tunnel exit. He understood what it meant. He acted. And 160 men walked forward who might not have. That is the geometry of survival. That is the measure of what happened on the 13th of February 1945 at Fort William McKinley, in the heat and confusion and mathematical certainty of combat. If this story meant something to you, if it changed how you think about initiative under pressure or the decisions that separate survival from catastrophe, hit that subscribe button. Give this video a like so more people can learn about soldiers like Manuel Perez who won battles through intelligence rather than just firepower. And leave a comment answering this question. In your own life, when have you seen someone solve an impossible problem by observing what everyone else missed? What did they see that changed everything? Let's talk about it below.